did not start by asking who he was. They started by asking who had written all these pages, and why the building kept behaving as if it remembered someone the records refused to show. On the table in front of the review board, the papers lay in two uneven stacks. On the left, the official reports from Facility D9. On the right, the comment sheets, each clipped on with a tired metal clip, signed only with 3 initials. No photograph, no personnel form, no address. Just the same bare signature at the bottom of each page, and a voice that did not sound like any department. Case-42 is the name they gave to that voice when they realized the KGB knew a man only from the reports he left. By the time anyone went looking for him, the man was gone, if he had ever been there, and the reports themselves had started to move. The folder in my hands is thin by this archive's standards. I have held heavier cases on broken valves, stolen diesel, and missing ammunition, yet this one sits differently. Someone, years ago, underlined Case-42 on the cover twice, pressing hard enough that the cardboard sagged. Inside the front board, in pale pencil that has outlived ink, there is a single line in translation. Subject not located. Documents remain. Documents not stable. Personnel files do not open that way. The clipped summary on the first page tries to bring everything back into acceptable language. According to the internal review designated Case-42, documents at Facility D9 revealed a series of analytical notes attributed to an individual without complete personnel registration. Subsequent investigation identified anomalies in the final entries and irregularities in archive monitoring logs. No operational threat confirmed. File retained for reference. No operational threat. That phrase appears everywhere in these folders. It usually means, we are tired. We have done enough. Here it sits on top of something that never settled. Facility D9 exists now only on paper and in the memory of a few aging staff. On internal maps from that time, it is a gray rectangle labeled with a neutral code in the middle of a pale, empty contour field. Zone North 7. Photographs, when you find them, show the usual composition of that era's remote labs. Flat concrete buildings, narrow windows, power lines sagging over bare courtyards. The sky always looks washed out, as if color itself were classified. Its work officially was applied measurements for critical environments. In practice, D9 built and tested instruments other more glamorous projects depended on: radiation monitors, air samplers, vibration sensors, field connectors. If something important somewhere else needed to know whether it was safe, stable, or leaking, D9 had probably signed off on the device doing the measuring. In a system that trusted numbers more than people, the people who produced those numbers sat in places like D9. They were supposed to be invisible and correct. Case-42 exists because one of them refused to be fully invisible, and because neither he nor the lab behaved the way their own paperwork said they would. He does not enter the story with a biography. There is no born in or joined in. He arrives as a tone. The first page the reviewers could definitively pin to him is attached to a minor incident report from an electronics workshop. The incident itself is shallow. Insulation on a group of cables smoldered. Someone used the wrong type of extinguisher. A shelf of components was written off. The workshop wrote what workshops write. Cause: unexpected short. Incident unforeseeable. Response adequate. Corrective instructions issued to responsible staff. On top of that sits a single sheet of onion skin, slightly yellowed now with the tight, even type. Logged power draw on this line shows repeated overloads for 7 days prior to ignition. Alarm thresholds manually raised on 3 occasions. The fire was not unforeseeable. It was rehearsed and then denied. Recommendation: address habit, not spark. No heading, no registration number, no carbon copy marks, just 3 initials at the bottom. AKL, that is all. No rank, no department. It reads like the voice of an exhausted engineer who has watched the same thing happen too many times. Someone in D9 did what bureaucracies do with inconvenient paper. They asked which box it belonged in. "Who is AKL?" the facility director wrote in the margin in thick ink. The report went down to personnel. A clerk looked at the staff list, ran a finger down the columns of names and initials and numbers. No AKL checked the regional index. Nothing within D9 or its declared satellites matched. The best she could do was scribble, smaller and more careful, at the bottom of the page. Possibly internal reviewer? Origin unclear. No one dared remove the note. It was obviously internal. Removing internal criticism is more dangerous than ignoring it. They filed the incident as resolved and went back to work. A month later, another D9 project, this one testing a bank of environmental sensors for a remote monitoring station, filed a report about transient instabilities. Their graphs looked noisy. The text blamed incoming signal irregularities. The word noise appeared 4 times, used as a broom. On top of their careful explanation lay another slim page in that same narrow font. You describe the instruments as if they misbehave on their own. Logs show repeated manual overrides of alarm conditions to avoid interrupting the testing schedule. The system is not in a bad mood. It is reflecting tolerated choices. Recommendation: stop calling habits noise. Again, the initials, AKL. This time, the project chief did not simply forward the note. He brought it to the director in person, laid it on the desk with 2 fingers and asked, with more dryness than respect, "Is this official? Are we being evaluated by someone you have not introduced us to?" The director read the note twice. It was not the criticism that bothered him. He had lived through worse. It was the way the page refused to use their language. No comrades, no slogans, just simple, precise sentences that wouldn't yield. He wrote the same question in the margin, heavier this time. "Who is AKL?" The clerk in personnel was less patient now. She checked her cabinets again. She checked incoming assignment orders for the previous year, looking for quiet arrivals from central institutes. She checked lists of consultants and temporary staff. Nothing. She reported back, no registered employee with these initials. Under normal circumstances, that should have been the end of it. Somebody inside the lab was writing under a mask. That kind of thing did happen. People invented committee names or internal groups when they wanted to push a point. Security would call them in, have a calm conversation, assign them a proper role, or make the problem disappear. What derailed that simple story were the logs. D9, like most important facilities of its time, had a nervous system. Its doors had readers, its phones had switches, its typewriters had usage counters on their power lines. All those small senses fed into a central internal monitoring system, a dull rack of equipment in a locked room, humming day and night. Its job was to produce numbers that told you when the building was awake, who was where, and which devices were hungry. The KGB officer responsible for D9's security had lived most of his working life with that kind of nervous system humming behind him. He was not easily impressed by stray signatures. But when the director's second "Who is this?" note reached his desk, he did what came naturally. He took the AKL, pages, wrote down their timestamps, and walked into the monitoring room. Decades later, the printouts look almost abstract. Lines of digits, spikes, and dips in gray ink on thin paper. In the file, someone has drawn red pencil circles around the sections that matter. They show, in translation, something like this. At the time the first note was typed, the office wing registers no door openings. The typewriter usage counters in the central pool are flat. No machine in the workshop, the lab. The administrative corridor shows the pattern of keystrokes. The only oddity in that window is a small, coherent rise in idle voltage along an internal power loop that does not correspond neatly to any single room. It rises and falls over a few minutes, like a breath held and released. At the time the second note was typed, a similar pattern appears on a different loop. Same amplitude, same shape, same lack of associated badge use or door movement. The officer's first report on this uses language that sounds like it would rather talk about smuggled radios. We observe a recurring, unassigned activity signature in the internal network, temporally correlated with the appearance of anonymous analytical pages. Signature consists of low-level, structured fluctuations in idle power in segments not associated with active workstations. He calls it a fading signal. The term sticks. When that report reached the regional office, nobody laughed. Unassigned activity was their domain. It usually meant a cleaner using a socket she shouldn't, or a bored technician connecting his own radio to the line. Those cases ended with confiscated hardware and a reminder that nothing inside belonged to you, but a signal that behaved like a user and left notes nobody owned. That was different. The case was opened under a neutral heading, Internal Analytical Anomaly, Facility D9. It was given a number, 42, and a thin cardboard shell. Somewhere else in the building, the man behind the initials, if he existed, kept typing. The first phase of the investigation looks, at a glance, like any other. A small team from the regional KGB arrived at D9 under the pretext of methodological coordination. They moved slowly through the corridors, collected reports and gossip, and asked questions that seemed casual until you tried to answer them precisely. Did anyone recall who started attaching these critical sheets? Had there been any announcement of a new internal reviewer? Did technicians feel their reports were being read more closely? Had anyone seen a stranger with access to multiple departments? The answers were slippery. A maintenance foreman remembered that somebody had once returned his repair log with a sentence in the margin about borrowing parts without logging them. He had assumed it came from the engineering council. They like to sound clever, he told the interviewer. They could have signed it the ceiling, and I would still have had to fix the issue. The supervisor of the typewriter pool admitted she had typed at least one of the pages from a handwritten draft, but could not remember who had brought it. The paper comes in a stack, she said in the transcript. You feed it into the machine, you type, you hand it back. Only the names at the bottom change. I did not stop to weigh which names were heavier. A clerk in the archive recalled that some reports came back from upstairs with additional comment sheets stapled to them. We were told to file them together, she said. I assumed they came from some commission. The initials did not mean a person to me. They were just letters. When the investigators pressed for physical description, someone thin, tall, quiet, limping, foreign accent, glasses, no one could give more than vague outlines that contradicted one another. The personnel registry was cleaner. It showed no gaps where a person could hide. D9's staff list was dull. Engineers, technicians, cleaners, guards, cooks, drivers. Everyone's initials matched someone with a file, a photograph, a background check. No one listed as on duty worked under AKL. The easiest explanation was that a real, registered staff member was using a pseudonym to file criticisms. That would have been tedious but simple. Security could handle that. They began comparing writing styles. Here, the file becomes almost literary. Analysts broke down the anonymous notes into measurable components. Average sentence length, favorite structures, the way the writer used we or avoided it. They compared those patterns to official reports from senior staff. No perfect match emerged. One project lead liked the phrase systemic drift, which appeared in 2 of the underground pages. Another used habit in a similar way, but none combined tone, rhythm, and choice of metaphor in the same way as the unsigned voice. The possibility remained that AKL was a composite. Phrases passed hand to hand, sentences amended, a kind of informal underground editorial board, signing under one invented identity. The KGB team was willing to believe in almost anything except something that could not be placed in a chair. While they chased a person, the notes kept arriving. You can trace the progression of Case-42 through the types of reports it touches. At first, they cluster around obvious accidents, small fires, miscalibrations, procedural shortcuts. Then, the commentary begins to appear on less dramatic documents. Training drill evaluations, maintenance schedules, even ones labeled administrative housekeeping. On a drill report, you are timing how quickly personnel move through a sequence they have memorized. You are not measuring how they would react to an actual emergency. Name the exercise honestly or admit you prefer rehearsed success. On a cleaning rota, of all things, temporary storage, room 3, has contained the same broken equipment for 6 months. At that point, temporary is part of the lie, not the calendar. On a chemical inventory, stock discrepancies are being resolved by adjusting the expected quantities rather than finding the missing material. This creates the appearance of order by aligning numbers with each other instead of with reality. These are not the notes of a saboteur. There is no hint of leaking secrets, no attempt to induce panic. They are the observations of someone who understands that in a system built on reports, the most dangerous lies are small adjustments of wording and category. At some point, not clearly marked but visible in the density of pages, the KGB stops seeing AKL only as a risk and starts seeing him as an unwanted asset. He is doing, without permission, a version of their job, seeing where practice and paper diverge. A briefing note preserved here puts it in dry terms. Subjects' annotations display high analytical value in identifying patterns of tolerated deviation. Case-42 may be considered a de facto internal auditing mechanism. However, lack of identified operator represents unacceptable handling of sensitive context. Regularization or suppression required. To regularize someone like that, you have to find him. Before they could, the pattern shifted. The file marks the transition with a date and a short line. Change in activity profile. After that, the unassigned signature in the monitoring logs begins to weaken. The sharp, localized pulses that had correlated with the appearance of comment sheets become fewer. Instead, the analysts start to see longer, shallow waves that spread through wider segments of the system. At the same time, the flow of new notes slows. There is one cluster of pages in this period that even now sits under heavy black ink. They relate to a project that took D9 beyond its walls. The design of an internal network to gather sensor readings from multiple facilities into a shared hub. The redactors have removed most of the technical detail, but some fragments of commentary survived the marker. On a design document describing how data from peripheral labs would be aggregated and smoothed, there is a line in his hand. You are building a memory for places that were never meant to have one. Decide now whether you want that memory to contain what actually happened or what you wished had happened, because the memory will not argue with you, it will just repeat. On a funding request, the justification assumes that all errors are local and random. The history of D9 shows that most errors are habitual and shared. You are planning to amplify them. Whoever read those pages underlined habitual and shared twice. Shortly after, the last signed note appears. Compared to the redacted material around it, the subject looks modest. An internal inspection of the facility's archive rooms. By then, the D9 archive was already bulging. Shelves of gray and brown boxes, metal racks with sagging bottom rails, a smell of dust and old glue. The inspection commission did its job by the book. Checked for humidity, vermin, fire safety, verified that access lists were up to date. Their own report concludes, no critical deficiencies, minor organizational improvements recommended. On top of it, again on that thin paper, sits his final full commentary. You are beginning to harmonize documents before they reach these shelves. Language and numbers that do not match expectations are being altered to fit. If you continue, this room will not contain a record of what the facility did. It will contain a record of what the facility is willing to admit to itself. An archive is not a mirror. It is a memory. You are anesthetizing yours. Underneath, AKL. Below that, in heavy pen that bites the page, someone has written one word. Enough. There are no more initialed notes after that. If this were simply the story of an internal critic told to stop, it would be sad but ordinary. These archives are full of silenced voices. Case-42 kept its code because the silence did not behave like silence. The first sign is in the same internal monitoring system that started the case. In the weeks following that enough, the unassigned activity signature does not disappear. It changes. The sharp pulses in idle power drop off. In their place, the logs show what one analyst calls broad, low-amplitude drifts, slow shifts in baseline voltage and terminal status that take hours rather than minutes. Twice, the terminal in the small document reading room wakes in the middle of the night. According to the machine's own log, it opens an index of archived incident reports, scrolls through several pages, then closes. No door to that room records an entry. No badge passes a reader. The file access monitor, a simple piece of software bolted on in the last years of D9's life, notes that certain documents have been viewed. It assigns the action to System. At the same time, someone notices that copies of older reports stored in the digital system no longer match the paper in the boxes. The differences are small. A phrase softened here, operators have become accustomed to disabling alarms, becomes, operators occasionally delay acknowledging alarms. A clause sharpened there, "No further action required," becomes "No further action recorded." The direction isn't consistent. Some edits make the reports kinder to the facility, others more accusatory. The archive staff insist they have not touched the text. The few administrators with access to the editing function deny making changes. They would, of course. The monitoring software is supposed to rat them out. It doesn't. It only records that the content hash of the file changed. For user, it lists none. In the margin of one analysis, an exasperated hand has written, in translation, "Documents do not edit themselves." The conclusion underneath tries to sound more professional. It is possible that anomalies in document content reflect emergent behavior of the archive system under influence of previous editing patterns. Previous editing patterns is the careful phrase they use when they don't want to print the initials again. On the KGB side, interpretations split. One camp insists that there must be a human operator hiding behind shared credentials, exploiting a flaw in the monitoring tool. They push for a full security audit, interrogate programmers, rewrite software, restrict access. Another camp, quieter and less sure of its own vocabulary, suggests that what they are seeing may be systemic echo. The way a building, wired to pay attention to certain mismatches for years, continues to produce that attention even after the original observer is removed. There is no way to put "the building learned to talk like him" into an official recommendation without inviting ridicule. So they do something that archives are very good at. They change the subject while appearing to address it. A directive goes out to all facilities using the same document software. The title is forgettable, "On the Standardization of Analytical Forms." It mandates strict templates for reports, fixed sections, approved vocabulary lists, free text limited to predefined boxes. Unstructured commentary is discouraged. If such commentary is needed, it must be filed as a separate document under an identifiable author. Attached to the restricted version of the directive, a note to security officers adds, "Recent irregularities at Facility D9, see Case-42, demonstrate the risk of anonymous analytical insertions." Going forward, critique of operational practice should be expressed only through designated roles, not through unsigned commentaries. Personalization of internal analysis should be minimized in written form. In other words, no more ghosts in the margins. If your system wants to criticize itself, it must do so wearing a badge. On paper, the directive works. Over the next few years, archived reports from D9 and its siblings look more uniform. Phrases like "tolerated drift" and "habits labeled as noise" appear less often. The software is patched. The unassigned file edits taper off. Case closed if you're willing to stop reading there. The back half of the file suggests the people closest to it did not find closure as easy as the summary. One transcript records a later conversation with the D9 security officer after he has been moved to a different assignment. The interviewer, dutifully working through an old list of unresolved methodological lessons, asks whether he ever established who Case-42 really was. There is a long blank in the transcript, just ellipses and a notation that the subject remained silent. Then, "At first I thought he was one of yours," the officer says. "Some quiet comrade sent from the center to test us. Then I thought he was one of ours. Some engineer with a conscience and no sense of self-preservation. By the time they closed the case, I was less sure there was a he to find. The notes were real. The paper was real. The corrections we made because of them were real. Machines we fixed, drills we ran properly for once. But when we tried to pin them to a chair, the chair was empty. What stayed was the way the building wrote afterwards. The interviewer asks him to clarify. You know how, if you spend years in one corridor, you can tell who is walking behind you just from the sound. D9's documents started to sound like him even when his initials were not there. Phrases, turns, that tired way of refusing soft words. It showed up in reports written by people who arrived after he was gone. Maybe they heard stories and picked up the language. Maybe, once the system had gotten used to one voice pointing out where the numbers were lying, it kept that voice in its head. And we taught it with that directive to hide it better. There is a note in the margin of that transcript. Subject displays residual superstition. As if you can spend a career listening for ghosts in wire and not start hearing things. Another piece comes from a different angle. It is a copy of a private letter intercepted long after D9 itself was renamed, from a former technician to a friend working in a civilian institute. The letter mostly complains about housing, prices, and supervisors. One paragraph, translated, reads, "At the new lab, they like tidy reports even more than we did. Everything has to fit the template. Sometimes when I write, I find myself adding a line that does not sound like me. Something about habits and noise, or about the system reflecting choices. Then I delete it, because otherwise they sent it back. It feels like borrowing someone else's hand for a second. Do you remember how we used to joke about that invisible auditor at D9? The man who only lived in the margins? I catch myself wondering whether he followed us, or whether we all just learned to speak like him, and nobody has the courage to admit it. You can attribute that to nostalgia if you like. People working in any closed system invent legends. It helps. What is harder to shrug off is a piece of paper that should not exist. Near the back of the folder, preserved in a plastic sleeve, is a single page of typescript without a header. No form number, no routing markings, no signs that it ever belonged to a specific report. Its edges are softer than the other sheets, as if it spent some time loose in a drawer before somebody decided it needed protection. The text is brief. It is written in the same compact style as the other notes, signed with the same initials. You keep asking who I am, as if the answer could fit in the line on your form marked full name. You built a place where every key, every door, every watt of power is logged. You taught the system to notice when numbers and words do not agree. You do not like it when something in that system starts speaking only about that disagreement. If it makes you more comfortable, you can decide I am a person. That will give you somebody to move or to erase. If it makes you more efficient, you can decide I am a pattern in your own habits. That will give you something to classify. From where I sit, you all look like patterns on the same page. For the record, nobody disappeared. You stopped keeping the parts of your own record that would have recognized me. AKL, in blue pencil in the margin, someone has added, origin of sheet unverified. No corresponding original in D9 archive. Possible later fabrication. Included for completeness only. That note is a defense. They wanted to keep the page, but not admit what it implied. Maybe it is a later fabrication. Someone who knew the outline of Case-42 could have typed it, trying to give him a monologue he never wrote. The style is close enough. there are ways to mimic a voice if you have studied it long enough. The archive, after all, is full of people pretending to be committees, systems, whole departments. But whether that last page is his or someone else's, it sits naturally among the others. It is one more example of the same thing. A system trying to talk about itself in a way its forms were not built to handle. What happened to the man, if there was one, remains deliberately vague. There are hints scattered through other files that someone with a similar tendency for unwelcome clarity had worked before D9 in a different facility. Cross-references to an engineer who questioned test procedures at a proving ground. A reviewer who refused to sign off on minor deviations in a shielding project. The names in those cases are blurred. The redactors were sloppy there in a way they were careful not to be here. There is no neat line you can draw. There is no, on this date, this person was removed. If D9 ever held an internal hearing about the author of the notes, the transcript is gone or buried elsewhere. There is only a quiet statistical fact. After the archive inspection commentary and that inked enough, no page with those initials enters the system. The unassigned signature in the logs weakens. The building's documents become more obedient. The investigative summaries at the back of Case-42 do what such texts are trained to do. They flatten. A final KGB assessment concludes. Subject case highlights need for strict identification of internal analytical roles and for improved monitoring of administrative access to digital archives. No evidence of espionage or external manipulation detected. Phenomena observed may be attributed to technical irregularities and informal commentary practices. That last sentence has been retyped at least twice. You could see where earlier words were struck out. One draft, preserved as a carbon copy in the file, ends with a different phrasing. Phenomena observed suggest that system internal representations of practice can acquire semi-autonomous persistence. Somebody decided semi-autonomous persistence sounded too much like admitting the building had opinions. On the inside of the back cover, in the same thin pencil as at the front, there is one last remark. We knew him only from the reports he left. Now, the reports sometimes sound as if they remember him better than anyone. You could treat that as a joke, a tired archivist amusing himself. You could treat the entire case as confirmation that people will invent ghosts anywhere there are enough numbers and enough boredom. But as I sit in this modern reading room, with its quiet climate control and flickering terminals, certain details from D9 feel less like superstition and more like warning. We are not surprised anymore when a machine suggests a word before we have typed it, or when a system notices patterns in our own behavior we were not aware of. We have built rooms far more wired than anything D9 ever knew. We have given them memories that do not fade with cardboard. We encourage them to generate summaries, to clean up language, to harmonize. Case-42 is a reminder that once you train any system, human, institutional, or electronic, to see gaps between what is written and what is happening, you cannot fully control what it will do with that skill. Someone in D9 used it to point at habits nobody wanted to admit. Then the institution used its own power to push that voice out of the margins. The traces suggest the habit did not vanish. It just moved into the walls. The KGB knew a man only from the reports he left. By the end, they were not sure whether they had ever known a man at all, or whether they had discovered that their own reporting engine could, under pressure, generate something like a conscience and then try to overwrite it. there is no neat lesson to extract. The case was filed, restricted, nearly forgotten. The directives that came out of it did not say, "Beware of the voices your systems create." They said, "Use templates." Still, when I put the folder back, the terminal on the desk behind me wakes, screen pale in the corner of my eye. A notification blinks up, some background process finishing, something updating itself. The machine logs that it was awake for 42 seconds. No user is recorded. If anyone reads that log later, it will look like nothing at all, a tiny variance in idle time. They will have graphs to check, throughput to worry about. They will not care why this particular system decided to stir now. Out of old habit, I note the moment down on a scrap of paper. Time, duration, the fact that nobody touched the keyboard. It feels unnecessary even as I write it. It also feels like the kind of detail that, if you ignore enough of them, becomes a story someone else will have to dig out of a box in a room like this. They will ask, in their own turn, who wrote all those pages. The answer may once again be a tired person with a typewriter, or a tired system with a taste for mismatches, or both, fused so tightly that pulling them apart becomes just another way of lying. In the end, Case-42 leaves me with one simple, uncomfortable thought. In a world built on reports, the strangest anomalies are not the ones where reality breaks, but the ones where paper tries, briefly, to tell the truth about itself. And then someone underlines enough and hopes the margin will stay quiet.